Good afternoon, good evening, or good morning, depending on your location in the world. Hi, this is Mr. Patriarch. We are joined by wonderful guests today, Dr. Otto Pohl. Apologies for the late start. I was pulling a page out of Academic Agent's book with the with the late start. It was scheduled for 2 o'clock my time, but I just had to contact my boss right before the stream, so I was just handling that personal business. So today we have a very interesting topic, and I am happy to say that we're probably joined by a world expert in the field, literally. So this is going to be a good talk. So the topic for today is we're going to be discussing Dr. Otto Pohl's new book, The Years of Great Silence. And it's about you want to actually give us a read down of your the title and subtitle real quick?
The Years of Great Silence, the Deportation, Special Settlement, and Mobilization into the Labor Army of Ethnic Germans in the USSR, 1941 to 1955.
Excellent. Now in German. No, I'm joking.
Die Jahre des großen Schweigens.
No, that's great. All right. So this is, as many people will probably be peripherally aware, after World War II, there was a great movement, or you could say, rather, expulsion of Germans from parts of Central and Eastern Europe further west. And as far as the public imagination goes, that's kind of where it begins and stops. So can you tell us first, how did the Germans end up settling further east of the former east of the formal German lands?
Well, the settlement took place before the unification of Germany in 1871. And in fact, it's pretty much totally halted by the Russian government in St. Petersburg in 1871, in part because of the unification of Germany. But starting under Catherine the Great, who herself was German as far as native language and origins and what becomes Germany, obviously there's no Germany yet in the 18th century, she wanted to invite foreigners in to settle various parts of the Russian Empire, particularly the Volga region, which was between Moscow and the various nomadic tribes, the Kazakhs, which the Russian government at that time called Kyrgyz, so it's kind of confusing because the Kyrgyz were called the Black Kyrgyz or Wild Mountain Kyrgyz, and the Bashkirs and Kalmucks. So they had a initial manifesto in the end of 1762, but it didn't get much traction. It was pretty vague. So then in the summer of 1763, on 22nd of July, there's a very detailed manifesto inviting foreigners in that has a whole bunch of incentives, most notably free land, freedom of religion, freedom from taxation for 30 years, freedom from conscription for all eternity, which was a big draw, and right to communal self-government. And then they sent out actually agents, touts, to publicize this, particularly in the German-speaking lands. Hesse, in particular, one of the early regions of settlement. So you see in 1763 and 1764, a large number of people from Central Europe who are both being polled by these incentives offered by the Russian government and kind of pushed out by the horrors of the 7-Year War, what we call the French and Indian War, but which on the continent was between Prussia and France, really, with the German-speaking states providing the migrants to the Russian Empire in between those two powers, thinking, conscription and taxes, repression of confessional faith. These are all bad things, and we'd like to get away from them.
Excellent. And sorry, I forgot. I was in a bit of a. Sorry, my head was. I was thinking about work when I started this. But before, I guess, sort of moving on, can you please tell us, shill your book or anything else that you have at the start? So we discussed the book and where can, and I was just going to say there's links for it below. And when was this published?
It was published officially, I believe, 22nd of March this year.
Okay.
So the publisher is Ibidem Verlag out of Stuttgart, but the link you'll see is Columbia University Press, which is the distributor for the United States. So if you're in the U.S. or Canada, then the way to get it is from Columbia University Press, or if you really want to, you can use Amazon. But I know a lot of people don't like to use Amazon because of the person who owns it. If you are outside the U.S., if you're in Europe, you probably will have to go to Ibidem Verlag's website itself. But the website is available in both German and English, and they should be able to ship within the European Union and Great Britain. Now, it's kind of keep forgetting the UK is no longer part of the European Union.
Right. Yes, and I was also just going to say, if anyone is interested in checking out or purchasing Dr. Pohl's book, you can find a link for it, at least for the U.S., linked in the description below. So what you're describing with the Germans sort of settling the Volga region kind of reminds me a little bit of the westward expansion slightly to the United States, where there's all this largely undeveloped land, which has economic, agricultural, industrial potential. And as a course of U.S. policy, they incentivized people, also a lot of Germans too, to settle the lands west of the Mississippi. So it seems there is an economic incentive for the Tsarina, Empress Catherine the Great, to encourage that sort of immigration from outsiders. Also, you were mentioning protection of prescription. The incentive of not being conscripted in the future, and that if we look at the past, military conscription was pretty common in that part of Europe. I know that the Hessians, for example, everyone looks to Prussia as sort of the penultimate example of Germanic militarism. But I do know that apparently, I think the Hessians were actually the most conscripted state in Europe at the time. It was basically like a militarized state with basically a near universal conscription. Is that correct, Dr. Pohl?
I'm not an expert, but yeah, Hesse was known for using military mercenaries as an export for its. So it exported a lot to support the British to fight against the American revolutionaries in the period of after this immediately. So the 7-Year War is our French and Indian War. The kind of one of the first modern world wars, since it's fought everywhere between the British and the French. And then there is a second wave of migration in the early 19th century under first Catherine the Great's son, Paul I, who has a charter of privilege for Mennonites, a lot of them coming from Prussia, where they are no longer allowed to buy land because they won't serve in the Prussian military. And then a few years later, you have Alexander I, her grandson, opening up the territories that Catherine the Great annexed from the Crimean Khanate in Crimea and southern Ukraine, known as New Russia. for settlement. So there's another manifesto in 1804 by Alexander I, and you get a lot of migration into that region, the Black Sea region, both because of the incentives, which were kept from his grandmother, but it's also the Napoleonic Wars pushing people. So Prussia and Austria are on the eastern and southern parts of the German states that are the source of migration, mostly into the Black Sea region, and then France with Napoleon on the west. So the Rhineland areas, Baden, Württemberg, even Alsace, although it's technically part of France, it's ethnically German, provide a lot of migrants to this region. So you have a second big wave of German-speaking immigrants coming in the early and even up to the mid-19th century into what is now Ukraine and Crimea and southern Russia, and then there are some other waves that come in later. But the two big population centers up until the Second World War are the Volga region and Ukraine, particularly eastern Ukraine. There's a lot of Mennonite settlements that come there in the late 18th and early 19th centuries.
Interesting. Now, how would you describe the treatment or perhaps the relationship that these Russian immigrants had to sort of the wider population? Was their relationship kind of like, was it hostile? Did they sort of exist in sort of isolation? Were they sort of respected dependents of the crown, kind of like the Cossacks or something? What was their relationship to wider Russia and the state?
They basically settled in isolated communities that weren't even in contact with each other. So each colony would be based around the church. Most of them were Lutheran, but there were a sizable minority that were Roman Catholic. And then even though there are only about 10% of the Germans in Russia, because they were almost entirely literate and could write a lot about themselves, as well as being very economically successful, the Mennonites. But they didn't have any thing to do with each other. Even up until the 1950s and 60s in the United States, people descended of Germans from Russia in the Midwest. It was a big deal for somebody of a Catholic family to marry somebody of a Lutheran family. And when they first settled in the Volga, they had problems with rage from Kazakhs. There are 3 whole villages that are burned down in the first years of settlement by Cossack raids. There is, just before that, the uprising under Pugachev, which is in the Volga region and attacks the German settlements. So they don't have a great relationship with initially with the surrounding population. They tend to want to be isolated, and you have little interaction for a long time, because it's only after 1871 with the revocation of the privileges and the conscription in 1874, and then a little later mandatory introduction of Russian language in the German church schools in the villages, that you start to have any number of the German colonists, the descendants that could even speak Russian. So they're living in these kind of German-speaking, Lutheran, Catholic bubbles around the church and their various farms, because they were granted land by the Tsarist government. And they basically are Germans in Russia, but not certainly not Russians in any ethnic or cultural or even really a civic sense.
Right. So there's no great Russian melting pot at this time, essentially.
Uh,
So they definitely do not assimilate. They're like enclaves, essentially, ethnic
yeah, well,
enclaves.
they call them colonies, and there's
Yeah.
actually Catherine the Great initially has for the first 18 years a special section of the government, the Chancellery of Guardianship for Foreigners, and she abolishes it, but it's revived by her son Paul I, and then all the way up until they start to dismantle it in 1871, and it's completed by 1881. But they are a separate legal status as foreign colonists within the Tsarist government until the 1870s and 1880s, and then they are given the same legal status as freed serfs. Alexander II abolished serfdom in Russia in 1861.
Okay. Now you mentioned that there was conscriptions in 1874, and then basically it also sounds like in addition to other minority groups within the Russian Empire in the latter half of the 19th century, it seems that the Germans in Russia were sort of targeted for Russification for a certain sense. So you're mentioning the language policies of the Tsarist regime at the time and how they made that a requirement in these German schools. So was that would you say that that's fair, that the Russification policy of the czars more or less began to fall upon these German colonies as well?
Uh, well, what happens is that yeah, they are imposed, but it doesn't have all that much effect other than you start to see the development of bilingualism, mostly among men because they're the ones who serve in the military. But combined with economic problems in particularly the Black Sea, they entail the land. So what happens is the land that is owned by a family, all of it usually goes to the youngest son, who then has to pay out money to the other son so that they can buy land. So at one time, they owned an incredible amount of land, something like 17% of the territory in the Black Sea. Farmland was owned by ethnic Germans. But they ran out of, they were running out of, they couldn't get any more. So they have basically the solution for the Black Sea Germans was either to go further east. So you had particularly Mennonites starting in 1882 going to Central Asia. They set up colonies in the Talas Valley in what is now Kyrgyzstan. There's colonies set up in Kazakhstan. Later, from 1907 to 1914, a lot of Volga Germans go to Siberia. Now, in the Volga, the problem is there's a famine in 1891, 1892. The Volga has communal agriculture, like the Russian Mir for the Germans. So they redistributed the use of the land on the basis of the number of farmers. And then Stolypin came in and basically privatized most of the land for the Volga Germans, so that it was no longer communally owned and redistributed. But this meant there were a number of Volga Germans that were left with no land or very little land. So in 1907 to 1914, many of them go east into Siberia. The other thing that happens is, of course, a lot go west into the United States. A lot take advantage of the Homestead Act. A lot of Volga Germans go to Nebraska, Kansas, Colorado. A lot of Black Sea Germans go to North Dakota. A number go to South Dakota. So you have that migration, and they also, a number go to Canada, and a number of the ones that are Roman Catholic go to Argentina. particularly area of Entre de Rios, as well as Brazil. But I don't have as much information on Brazil as I do other regions. So you have this movement east and west, and the big flood in 1904, 1905, when ethnic Germans that had been conscripted into the Russian military served their initial tour of duty. So by this time, it was about 18 months. Were then mobilized for the reserve to fight against Japan. So my great-grandfather was in Western Ukraine, and he got a notice to be mobilized to fight against Japan. He had served 18 months previously in the Tsarist army, and so he left and went to Germany and then Canada and the U.S. But there was a huge number of Russian German men that leave to avoid mobilization to fight against Japan in the 1904, 1905.
Okay. Interesting. Now, with the integration of, so you mentioned in 1874 that the Germans were then subject to conscription, correct?
Most of them. The Mennonites still managed to negotiate an exemption. They did work in forestry or other combat alternative service, including planting trees in Central Asia, although it's not real forested even now. But for the Lutheran majority, as well as the Catholics, who were the next largest denominational group, they obviously, unlike the Mennonites, didn't have a religious objection to military service per se. They're not fundamentally pacifist the way the Anabaptists are.
Right. Now, this sort of leads us up to, so you mentioned the Russo-Japanese War and that a lot of these Germans ended up becoming integrated in the army and were utilized in this conflict. Thinking about historical characters, would Peter Wrangel, is he one of these guys who was sort of one of these Volga German settlers whose ancestors got integrated in the army, or was he sort of more of a German aristocrat from abroad who married in? Because you also had that as well, definitely.
Neither. The Baltic Germans, who numbered at one time about 200,000, are descendants of the Northern Crusades of the Teutonic and Livonian Knights in what is now Estonia and Latvia. And so Etland and Livland, that is Estonia and Northern Latvia, are taken by Peter the Great from Sweden in 1721. And then the other western part of Latvia, Courland, is taken from Poland later. But the Treaty of Nystadt basically preserves all of the privileges that the German barons, the land-owning class, and as well as the merchant class, the burghers, had already. The areas were also incorporated into the Hanseatic League as well as the Teutonic Order. So they were the privileged group ruling the societies before they were even conquered by the Swedes. And then the Swedes just basically recognized their power, and the Russians did the same. And so a lot of these Baltic Germans did make the conversion from Lutheranism to Russian Orthodoxy, and became high-ranking members of the Russian military. General Kaufmann, who conquered Tashkent, was one of them. Peter Wrangel was another. So when you look at all these German names in the Russian officer corps, they're almost always from Estonia and Latvia. Wrangel was from what is now Estonia.
Descended of Teutons. That would explain the the military rank as well. Interesting. So now that we sort of come up to World War I, what was the general and leading past World War I, where you had the Russian Civil War? What was the Germans' general disposition to the conflict within Russia? Did they tend to be Tsarist loyalists? Did they tend to be non-affiliated or part of the Greens, like the peasant revolts or whatever? How was their position?
None of them. All right. So during World War I, there is what the liquidation laws, which prohibit Germans from owning or leasing land 150 kilometers from the front. And then once the land is confiscated, they are deported eastward by the Russian army into the Volga region or Siberia in 1915 and 1916. Most of them coming from Volhynia, which is western Ukraine, which is where my great-grandfather was from. And they are swept out of there, about 130,000, and about 70,000 more from Congress Poland, Lithuania, Bessarabia, which is now Moldova. And there are plans to deport all of the Germans into Siberia, including those in the Volga, in March of 1917. But the February Revolution, overthrowing the Tsarist government and the provisional government coming to power, leads that the deportation plans are annulled for the time being. They are resurrected by Stalin during the Second World War in 1941 in a socialist version, but for the time being. So the World War I, there's a pogrom in Moscow against Germans as well. So they're not treated very well at the end of the Tsarist era by the Russian government. And like lots of non-Russian ethno-national groups, they try and organize for their own autonomy, including in the Volga, but also in the Black Sea and in Siberia and in Crimea and other places. And they're not terribly successful on their own, although the ones in Ukraine do come under German protection during the First World War for a while. So as do, so after the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, 3rd of March 1918, until the defeat of the Germans in the West, November 11th, 1918, the Germans in Ukraine, in Crimea, are under German protection. And those in the Volga, they have the right under the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk to migrate to Germany and take their capital with them. I think it's I can't remember what the name. There's two articles in the treaty specifically referring to Volga Germans and their right to return, as it were, to the fatherland. But of course, in November 1918, the Germans are defeated, and so the Bolsheviks are in power everywhere. But one of the things that by this time the Bolsheviks have noted is that they can play on Tsarist repression of non-Russians, particularly the language issue, to get support or at least neutrality or at least ameliorate hostility from non-Russians. So the first autonomous region ever in Soviet Russia is the Volga German Workers' Commune, which will later become the Volga German Autonomous Soviet Socialist Republic. And that is established by Lenin in October of 1918. So the 19th of October, 1918, there is the Volga German Workers' Commune established as the first ethno-state in what will become the Soviet Union in December 1922.
Interesting. So it sounds more or less that they began the Germans' position to Russia, aside from, again, like you mentioned, these sort of Baltic Germans who'd integrated themselves into the Russian hierarchy and had largely converted Orthodoxy.
No, well, not
Seems that
largely. The ones that were serving in the Russian state, most of those are still in Latvia and Estonia, just as landlords or as merchants, were still Lutheran.
okay. But yeah, I was talking specifically like people like Wrangel and stuff, people who sort of joined the establishment. Did they largely convert to Orthodoxy, or did they
Yeah, well, you
maintain
had
their?
to if you wanted to serve in the military as an officer or to be a civil servant in the Tsarist government. So, but the three official things for Russian nationalism under the Tsar uh, were that you speak Russian, which they all did as a second language in addition to German, and that you convert to Pravoslav, the Russian Orthodox Church, and this was considered to be quite important. But they did allow anybody to convert. So if you were a Jew or a Muslim and you converted to Orthodoxy, you could still be accepted as well. So it wasn't exclusive as long as you made the conversion. And then third, of course, the loyalty to the Tsar. So it was not a blood-based. Obviously, the Germans are not Slavs, but I mean, you see this with other groups too. Tatars, that convert from Islam to Russian Orthodoxy and serve in the Russian military as nobles in the Russian government.
Okay. So it seems early on, at least, based on what you said, that the Soviets were able to ingratiate themselves to a certain extent with these sort of non-affiliated, non-Orthodox Russian populations within within Russia itself. Is that correct?
Well, there's a huge uprisings by almost all of the major and even many of the minor non-Russian groups to get autonomy or even complete independence. And they are at odds with the Bolsheviks trying to keep all of, or as much as they can, of the territory of the Russian Empire under their control. So what happens, particularly in the 1920s, the 12th Party Congress in 1923, is this policy of Korenizatsiya to basically make the Soviet Union a federation of these symbolic ethno-states, but to definitely make the concession on Soviet versions of the culture and the use of their own languages. Because what happens is you had Poland, Finland get their independence permanent during this time. Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania get it for until the beginning of the Second World War in 1940. And then even Ukraine, Georgia, Armenia, Azerbaijan have 3 years of independence from 1918 to 1921. Other places that attempted it, Crimea, Kazakhstan, are less successful. But you can see we're already talking that large chunks of the former empire managed to successfully break away for a few years. And if it had been longer, it would have been quite devastating to the Soviet kind of project here. So we have to remember that Tsarist Russia was only 49% ethnically Russian. The Soviet Union was a little bit higher, about 51%, because Poland and Finland and the Baltic states and Bessarabia go missing. But still, almost half the population are non-Russians. And many of them are quite different than Eastern Slavs. So places like the Caucasus and Central Asia, basically totally alien civilizations as far as places like Moscow or St. Petersburg are concerned.
Yeah, definitely. Now, leading up to World War One, I'm sorry, World War Two. World War II. We'll handle this chronologically. So we had the initial period where it seems like there was and based on what I understand of Soviet history when I was studying it a bit, it seemed that early on there was this embrace of like diversity and this notion that yes, we need to sort of respect some of the end this policy of Russification, try to respect certain languages, customs, and cultures and whatnot within a socialist context. And then this begins to change, as you were saying, later on after the death of Lenin, to a large extent. Is this generally true? So, sort of leading up until World War II, how would you explain the relationship of the state to Germany?
Policy enunciated at the 12th Party Congress in 1923 is called Korenizatsiya. It usually translates as indigenization, but it literally means to take root. So basically, they were trying to govern the non-Russian areas of the Soviet Union by creating their own communist party and state elites among the indigenous population within kind of this union of governed by socialist ideology, right? So this was basically taking Lord Lugard's idea for ruling West Africa of indirect rule up to 11, right? That is not only rule through local elites, but create the local elites and make those, and in the creation of those local elites, make them completely and totally dependent upon the center for their power and privileges. So you basically get, these ethno-states have no political or economic autonomy, but they are allowed socialist versions of culture and history and pride in their own ethnicity, and they do have special privileges, affirmative action for the titular nationality. So if we look at the Germans, the Volga German autonomous Soviet Social Republic is created in February 1924 on an upgrade from the Workers' Commune. Right, they have German language schools. The court system is done in German in the German cantons. You have German language newspapers. You have a German language publisher, German language theater, and you also have money for collection of German folklore. A German museum is established. So you have, and this is done on a smaller scale in the little districts, rayons. 8 of German ones in Ukraine, 6 in the Russian Federation outside of the Volga, German ASSR, 1 in Georgia, and 1 in Azerbaijan. So these kind of like your mini ethno-states to preserve the language and culture and this kind of symbolic ethnicity, right? So they don't have any political or economic autonomy, but they basically are allowed to promote German or the. It's not the same, but I mean the German culture that had developed in the Russian Empire. In many ways, perhaps could be argued a more authentic culture than in Germany itself, because it kind of freezes in the 18th and the early 19th centuries before globalization.
Interesting. Now, from a power politics perspective, this kind of makes sense on the behalf of the Soviets, in my opinion. You basically, like you said, you create these elites to govern over these different ethnic populations, minority populations within Russia itself. and then they owe their. So I think Machiavelli even talks about this, how the strength of what he calls the Turkish system is that the central authority delegates power through these ministers, and they owe their entire position to the central authority, and thus they're more likely to be loyal and have lower aspirations than, say, a traditional aristocracy. But at the same time, in this context, they are withdrawn from the ethnic stock of the people they're ruling. So there's a relationship where you have, where you manage to sort of, you undermine nationalism and like national political aspirations, while at the same time maintain control of the economy and political system, but at the same time granting a certain degree of what you would call maybe superficial or cultural autonomy within the wider society.
Yeah.
And it sounds to me almost kind of like what the Ottomans tried to do with the millet system. Is that like a fair?
There are some parallels, but the millet system actually did have quite a bit of autonomy for self-ruling minorities.
Okay.
Is in the case of the Soviet Union, the socialist ideology have to always be taken into consideration. But what you do have is basically the idea that those parts of national self-determination that we felt the most by the average person would be appeased. So like Stalin says, if you really want to piss somebody off, I'm paraphrasing, then prohibit him from using his indigenous language, right? So if you're told you can't speak your native tongue, right, that's going to make you real angry. And it doesn't really do anything for the regime, right? But the regime says, no, you can do everything in your native language. You just have to say that, you support socialism, right? Just make the slogan in, German or Uzbek or Ukrainian, right? And for the average person, right, being able to use their native language is something they take for granted. If you take it away from them, then they're going to get very hostile. So, I mean, this is the types of things that the Soviets were saying. If we make the concessions for culture that the people care the most about, but which have the least effect on our ability to maintain control over the political territory and the economics of it, and then we'll come out ahead. And this is basically, for most of the large ethnic groups of the Soviet Union, what they do all the way until the Soviet Union collapses. There's the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic and an Uzbek Soviet Socialist Republic and the Buryat Autonomous Soviet Socialist Republic, all the way to the Soviet Union collapses. And in the current Russian Federation, those that were in the RSFSR are still there. So they're, still a Tatar Republic. There's still a Chechen Republic. There's still a Buryat Republic. There's still a Yakut Republic. And some of these, like the Tatars and the Yakuts and the Chechens, have a very great amount of autonomy within their territories today, much more so than they did under the Soviet rule, particularly control of economic resources.
Interesting. So it's kind of more of, today, it's more kind of federalism based on these sort of ethnic republics in Russia, whereas in the past it was more what you would call superficial. So the government controls again, so they granted autonomy for these sort of cultural aspects and sort of self-rule within local sphere, but in terms of the ideology, the economy, and all that sort of stuff, and sort of political correctness, that was sort of dictated from the top and enforced through these local elites.
Right. So yes, I mean, I think the big difference between the territories today in the Russian Federation and under the Soviet is that there's more political autonomy, but there's a lot more economic autonomy. So both Tatarstan with oil and Yakutia with oil and diamond managed to get a lot more control over their local resources vis-a-vis Moscow in the post-Soviet era than they certainly had under the Soviet era.
Okay, so in that sense, it's kind of more like we could look at it as maybe analogous to like Texas having control over
More analogous to
resources on
the
state
Navajo
lands.
nation having control over its uranium.
Right. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So that is sort of much more similar to what we would sort of see in the United States today, for example, but different, obviously, because of the diversity of these different example, like Chechens, Yakuts, and so on and so forth. Okay. Now, leading up until World War II, when does there is, which obviously goes into the subject of this book. So again, the subtitle: the deportation, special settlement, and mobilization into the labor army of ethnic Germans in the USSR, 1941 to 55. So obviously, there's a clear shift of policy from the Soviet government vis-a-vis the Volga Germans, or all Germans within the Soviet Union. When does this begin to shift? Do we begin to see maybe a changing of attitude parallel to the time of, let's say, the Yozovshchina, the Great Purges? Is there sort of preludes leading up to this change of policy of the Soviet state to the German population before they go whole hog?
Yeah, I mean, you obviously, there's a lot of repression even in the 1918 to 1921 era, but it's not targeted on an ethnic basis. But because of the prosperity, class repression is pretty significant against the Germans in the Volga and particularly Black Sea region at this time. But you also then start to see move from class enemies to ethnic enemies. So the first time, I think the document I've seen where it specifically talks about targeting Germans for being Germans is 1929, and it's a decree out of the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic on the dekulakization of German kulaks in Nikolaev Oblast. So it talks about specifically removing German kulaks, not just kulaks. And you see in 1930, 1931, with the mass deportation of some 1.8 million people branded as kulaks to remote areas of the Soviet Union as special settlers and put in special settlement villages, that there are numerous reports of the people carrying out the collectivization and dekulakization in Ukraine, making lots of ethnic and racial slurs and epithets against two groups, one of which are the Germans and the other of which are the Poles. So you have these two diaspora groups already in the early 1930s being targeted in part on the basis of ethnicity. And then you already brought up the Great Terror in 37 and 38. But the Great Terror has several components, but one of the components was a series of national operations against foreign spies, disproportionately targeted the diaspora groups as being spies for their ancestral motherland. So the largest of this operation was the Polish operation, some 100,000 people executed, mostly ethnic Poles. And then the next largest was the German operation. And out of 46,000 or so Germans shot in 37 and 38, the majority of those were during the German operation.
So it would seem that to a certain extent, And I guess this would kind of make sense if you look at the historical circumstances of Germans in Russia, being given land, largely becoming landowners and sort of, yeoman farmers and whatnot, that they would be kind of as a group targeted for dekulakization as landed peasantry, essentially. So is that essentially kind of what happened, where to be a German in Russia was to be a kulak to a certain extent?
It happens in Ukraine. It's less prominent in the Volga, as far as because the Volga German Autonomous Soviet Social Republic is 2/3 German, and the rural areas even more so. So it doesn't have come out, but the German minority in Ukraine, about 400,000 people, you do see this disproportionate attack on them as being kulaks by virtue of being German. So you have some 60,000 or so Germans that are deported as kulaks from 1928 to 1932, and about 25,000 of those are from the Volga region, and the rest from other areas, including Ukraine and the North Caucasus, Georgia, Azerbaijan.
Okay. Now, it seems, obviously, if we look at the dates of the deportation and special settlements, 41 to 55, this directly parallels between the beginning of hostilities of Germany and Russia, Germany and the Soviet Union, and the death of Stalin. So can you sort of explain to us briefly sort of how and...
Yeah, okay, so the 22nd of June, 1941, the West decide to move eastward and attack the Soviet Union in Operation Barbarossa. And there isn't much happening regarding Soviet policy toward Germans for the first few months of the war. So in June, basically nothing happened. July, they start to remove Germans from the Soviet Red Army. But they don't officially remove all of them until 7th of September, 1941. So you have a period of time in June and July where there's kind of ambiguity what to do. The Germans in the Red Army, almost all from the Volga, about 33,000, are involved in heroic defense of Brest against the Wehrmacht. So there isn't, in their minds, a question of loyalty. They consider themselves to be loyal to the Soviet government. But in August 15th, 1941, you have the mass removal of some 60,000 Germans in Crimea into Orjonikidzhi Krai and Rostov Oblast on the other side of the Black Sea. And they are used to help with the harvest and then deported with the rest of the population to Kazakhstan in October. And then we have in August 26th of 1941, there was a decree from the Central Committee of the Communist Party and the Council of People's Commissars to deport all of the ethnic Germans from the Volga German Autonomous Soviet Social Republic and the bordering Saratov and Stalingrad Oblast. And there was a public decree by the Presidium of the Supreme Soviet issued 2 days later on the 28th of August, and they begin the roundup and deportation of 450,000 Volga Germans on 3rd of September 1941.
That's a lot of people.
Well, it gets more. It ultimately, between 3rd of September 1941 and 31st of December 1941, they will forcibly relocate about 800,000 Soviet citizens of German ancestry into Siberia and northern Kazakhstan.
And to put that into context, that's a little more than like relocating the entire state of Alaska to somewhere to Siberia.
Yes, in terms of numbers here, it's comparable, and also because they're geographically spread out, it's also comparable to the Volga and the Ukraine and the Northern Caucasus and the Transcaucasus. It's comparable to the Ottoman relocation of Armenians during World War I into the deserts of Syria. It's about the same number of people, and there's a lower mortality rate among the Germans, but it's still quite high. So in terms of, we want to look at kind of a similar historical event, the genocide against the Armenians has a lot of similarities in the way it's carried out.
Yeah, I guess the Germans at least didn't have to worry about being dropped off in the middle of a desert.
Well, they were dropped off. Have you been to Kazakhstan? There's a lot of desert there.
Yeah, I guess. But isn't there a lot of flat plains, like sort of steppe conditions?
It is, but a lot of it was not suitable for permanent farming. And this is why the famine in 1930 to 1933 of the Kazakhs is they forcibly settled the nomads, and the pasture land could only support the livestock for about 6 months. And so then they had to slaughter the animals and eat them, but then there's no food for the next 6 months.
Great. Brilliant. All right. Now, sort of once these sort of relocations of these, you said about total 800,000 Germans was completed, how did the Soviets utilize these people in the various locations?
Well, initially they were almost all deported to collective farms, kolkhozes, including the urban population. So Krasnoyarsk Krai, which is the furthest east they were deported to, which is in eastern Siberia, some 70,000, 75,000 Germans. Over 60% of them were urban, and many of them people who had never been on a farm, who were working as things like doctors or accountants or other urban professions. So in this sense, they have really suffered because they had no experience and no background and no training to do work in agriculture. And so they're not very happy that all their property that they had has been confiscated. There's a lot of tension between them and the local population, particularly in Kazakhstan, where the Kazakhs are, this time, most of them do not speak Russian. They're quite different culturally from the Germans, and the Germans are being basically housed in the same houses as the Kazakhs. So there's a lot of tension and hostility. The Germans don't want to work because they're not very happy of being robbed and dumped out in the middle of nowhere. So the solution is that almost all of the able-bodied young men at first, and then this is extended to women, it's the only group where it's extended to women, are mobilized to be conscripted for forced labor, the so-called labor army. And so you have massive mobilization starting on 10th January 1942. It applies to men who were deported, so between the ages of, I believe it's 17 and 50 initially. And then they can't get enough able-bodied workers from that conscription, in part because the government of Kazakhstan wants to keep all the combine drivers and tractor drivers and other skilled agronomists that had been deported there because all the Kazakh and Russians capable of doing that have been conscripted to fight in the Red Army against the Germans. And then, so they then conscript the Germans who are already living in the area before the deportation. So, on 14th of February, 1942, the Germans that had already been living in Siberia and Kazakhstan, who are men 15 to 50, are mobilized. And then finally in October, it's 17 to 50. In October, they make it 15 to 55 for men. So adolescents and older men. And they also conscript women from 16 to 45 who are not pregnant and do not have children under the age of 3. So all in all, about 316,000 adult, able-bodied Germans are conscripted for forced labor. About 182,000 of them do the service in labor camps, the first 2 conscription waves in January and February. And then the third one is mostly to civilian commissars of coal for men and civilian commissar of oil for women. So another about 72,000 men and 50,000 women. And then in 43, there's about 30,000 more conscripted, mostly women, sent to places like Vorkuta, which is north of the Arctic Circle, to do things like mine coal.
So farms, mines, various labor camps. Sounds great. Now, this change, sorry. This is largely a wartime measure by the Soviet regime, yet this persists right up until 1955. What is the change of their condition, if any, after the war, essentially? So from after 1945.
Well, after 1945, they actually extend the special settlement restrictions, not being able to move beyond 3 kilometers or so of your assigned village without special permission from the NKVD, and having to report to them at least on a monthly basis, kind of interrogation with the police. They extend it. So you have one group, there was a group of Germans that were already in Kazakhstan and Siberia. A number of them, particularly in Kazakhstan and Central Asia, are then, after the war is already over, placed under the special settlement restrictions. So of the 200,000 or so of these local Germans, about 100,000 of them are placed under the special settlement restrictions after the war is over in 1945 and 1946. So almost all of the local Germans in Kazakhstan, I think there's only like 200 that aren't made special settlers, as well as those in Kyrgyzstan and Uzbekistan. So the only places where you have large numbers that aren't put into special settlement restrictions are the local populations in, I believe, Omsk Oblast, Altai Krai, and Chokolov Oblast. So about 100,000 total. But the other the other half of the local population, particularly in Kazakhstan and Central Asia, are made special settlers after the war. And the Germans that were saved from deportation in Ukraine from the NKVD by the German military, they are forcibly repatriated for the most part. So about 300,000 were evacuated by the Wehrmacht into the Warthegau, what is now Western Poland, and then moved further into Germany. But about 2/3 of those, about 200,000, are forcibly repatriated back to the Soviet Union by the United States and Great Britain military. And they are also sent as special settlers. So you end up at the end of Stalin's life in the late 40s and early 50s, about 1.3 million ethnic Germans in the Soviet Union, 1.2 million of them under special settlement restrictions. And about, of those, 100,000 are locals and 200,000 are people forcibly repatriated from Germany.
Not a good time to be a German in that part of the world. After the Second World War, are most of these people just sort of confined to these collective farms and villages and regions? Is the labor camp aspect of
The
the wartime coal mines and stuff, does that
yeah
largely go away?
the labor army starts to be dismantled piecemeal, but most of the people in it serve all the way till 1948.
Mm.
So we're talking 3 years after the war is over, and there are some people that are not released until 1957, which is 4 years after Stalin dies. Now, the special settlement regimes, they start to dismantle it in 1954, the year after Stalin dies, but the last of the Germans' population, basically the adult population that were not members of the Communist Party and did not fight at the front, and a few other small groups, some almost 700,000 people. They're not released until the very end of 1955. So 13th of December 1955, they're released from the special settlement restriction. But when they're released, and they're not told about it until actually early 1956, they all have to sign a document saying that they will, one, not ever try and return to their original places of settlement from which they were deported, and two, that they will not seek any compensation for any of the property they have lost.
So yeah, expropriation without compensation. Hey, yeah, we took
Yes.
all your stuff. Yeah, special settlements is over, but yeah, we're not going to give you anything back, essentially. All right. So, what is the German condition after 1955 until basically the end of the Soviet Union?
Well, it changes, but basically they are not allowed to live in the western parts of the Soviet Union, west of the Urals. Officially, they are banned as an entire ethno-national group from living in European parts of the Soviet Union until 1972, 3rd November. But even after that, not many are allowed to, because each individual has to be approved by the KGB and the OVER office, and it can be rejected if they make an application to move to western part of the Soviet Union. So most of them remain confined in the east, and they start moving south because Siberia is cold. So you get a huge influx into Kazakhstan and into Kyrgyzstan. So Kyrgyzstan goes from having like 15,000 Germans to over 100,000 Germans. Kazakhstan goes from having 400,000 Germans to having over 1 million. So Central Asia becomes kind of the center of their existence, and they are discriminated against for admission to universities, and this has effects on their jobs. So most of them end up either working on farms or as coal miners or factory workers, but almost none in the intelligentsia, things like university professors. Very low membership in the Communist Party, very low participation in Soviet government organs, very, very, very low membership in the KGB and officer corps of the Red Army. There's very little done to restore the German cultural institutions that existed because they no longer have any autonomous territories. So while they do restore some German language publications, there's one in Moscow called Neues Leben that is started after the Second World War, and there's one in Kazakhstan called Freundschaft, and one in Siberia, I believe Altai, called Rota Fana. I think And there's some German language radio in Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan and Siberia, and some German language schooling, but it's very small compared to the total population. And it's not very effective. So they become at this time quite Russified culturally, but at the same time, they have on all their identification documents that they're German, and this, of course, hinders them every time they want to apply to go to a university or apply for a desirable white-collar job or apply for membership in the Communist Party or Komsomol or any of these other prestigious organs that would help them economically and socially. So they want to restore the Volga German ASSR so they can get back the infrastructure for schooling and media and other German language culture, and this is rejected. And so then they basically, in the early 70s, decide they're never going to not be discriminated against for being Germans or allowed to resurrect any type of autonomous German culture in the Soviet Union. So they start agitating to leave the Soviet Union and go to West Germany. So they can basically copy, starting in 73, what the Jews started in 1967.
Now, we don't hear a lot about Germans in the Russian Federation today. So I would imagine that after the collapse of the Soviet Union, most of them began to flee to Germany. Is that correct?
Actually, from Russia itself, the population, only about half of them left. There's still about 400,000 ethnic Germans in Siberia. There are 2 autonomous districts. There is Halbstadt, which was one of the old ones from the 20s that was restored in Altai. And there's a new one called Osovo in Omsk. But yeah, there's still about 400,000 ethnic Germans in Siberia that have opted to remain. They do get assistance for various things from the German government. In Kazakhstan, there's about 180,000 Germans still, particularly around the area of Akmola. So this is a much greater decrease. They're going down from almost 1 million to less than 200,000, 80%. In the rest of Central Asia, it's much greater. So Kyrgyzstan went from 100,000 to it's about 8,000 now. So 92% drop. Tajikistan had about 35,000, and almost all of them left. A lot of that had to do with the Tajik Civil War in the 1990s.
I guess that brings it up to a wrap. Let us go through. If any of you guys have any questions or want to send super chats or anything, please feel free to, and we'll answer them. Reminder to go check out Dr. Pohl's links in the description of this video. You'll find a link to his book, which I would encourage you guys to check out and purchase if you got the coin for it. Let's see.
$42.
There you go. Let's see if we can't, which is a good deal for academic literature, generally speaking. Academic books are expensive, man. But yeah, you can.
Well, the way this publisher managed to reduce the cost was this is a trade paperback rather than a hardback for the initial offering.
There we go.
Otherwise, it would be more than double.
Yeah. No, it definitely would be. Let's see if we can't ship some copies. So going here through the chat, checking any questions. Again, yes, if you guys have any questions or want to send any super chats, please feel free. Going through here, I think I see one. Here we go. So from Neo-Confucian Orthodoxy, interesting username. I want to ask Otto one thing, Russian versus non-Russian fertility growth rates. I know it stunted a lot under Soviet rule. If the Soviets hadn't ruled, would the empire be proportionally more Russian?
Probably. It's hard to say, but you know, some of the fastest growing ethno-national groups in the Soviet Union were the Muslim groups, particularly those that were settled. So the Uzbeks, for instance, had a massive increase. Whereas by the time it got to the end of the Soviet Union, the Russian population and the East Slavic population in whole, Belarusian and Ukrainian, was declining. A lot of it had to do with low birth rates, which a lot of that also had to do with the fact that you had very high abortion rates. So it wasn't necessarily that fertility was low. It was that between conception and birth, the children were not surviving.
Very brutal. Yes, I remember I had a university. I had a class, and on the Soviet Union, my professor was a kind of specialist in the area. And yeah, that was one of the things he mentioned, is that in the Soviet Union, abortion was basically used as birth control for the as a means of sort of controlling fertility rates.
Yeah, because they didn't trust Western birth control, so they wouldn't import it. And I think I don't know if there was a Soviet version of the pill then or not. There were certainly Soviet versions of condom. But if you talk to post-Soviet people, or people that grew up in the Soviet Union that are still in the territory, like in Central Asia, there is a very, very strong aversion by women to the pill. They say it does bad things to their body. I don't know if this was some sort of Soviet propaganda against the American birth control pill, but I do know that it probably it does have some basis in truth that the pill does bad things to this women's bodies. So there was that. And while they did produce condoms, I think there was, like everything else, they were in constant shortage.
Yeah, if they can't make windshield wipers for cars, like making dong bags is probably not a high priority either. Also, in terms of the population growth rates of the Soviet Union or Russians, if you keep in mind about the sort of demographic catastrophes that sort of happened from the beginning to sort of like the middle point of the 20th century. I mean, you had World War I, which killed millions of Russians. You had the Russian Civil War and the ensuing famine, which killed millions of Russians. Then you had the oppression of the Soviet state itself, which killed millions of Russians. And then you had World War II, which killed tens of millions of Russians. So, and if you sort of look at these knock-on effects over the course of the remaining century until present day, I think it's very fair to assume that the Russian population today would no doubt be significantly larger than it is now had basically these millions of Russians not been killed / murdered over the course of the 20th century.
I mean, you have two things going on, and it's hard to calculate. But the first one is just how many people are killed, and the second one is how many children they would have had if they hadn't been killed prematurely. So the demographic loss from communism is probably about 60 million. But when you throw in World War I and World War II, then you're probably talking 150 million. That is, the Russian population itself would be about 300 million rather than 150 million today.
So it'd be, basically double what it is and close to on par with the United States.
Right. But also the other countries would also be higher. I mean, in some cases it wouldn't be as high, like the Uzbeks, but certainly the Kazakhs lost 25% of their population in the 33 famine. So that's a huge loss. So they would obviously have also increased greatly. It's hard to do the numbers and all of this because you're making assumptions about what is normal fertility. and what is not. So how many people that are not born, but even finding out how many people are there in the first place, and then how many people are left, and how many people died, is not that easy. But yes, certainly there's incredible losses for all of these groups, and they're not evenly distributed. Certainly, groups like the Germans, we add in all of the excess premature deaths from famine and repression between 1918 and 1948 or so. I would say it's probably 700,000. So you're talking a population that at the end of Tsarist rule was only 2 million, and at the end of Soviet rule had gotten back up to 2 million finally. But a lot of that had to do with between 1948 and 1956, there's just a huge increase in compensatory birth among the group. That is, all these men that were in the labor army are like, okay, I'm going to do nothing but have sex and make babies now that I'm free.
It's a good plan. Yeah, real baby boom. Also, that's an interesting point you bring up. So not only the Russian population of ethnic Russians, which, you know, you could say sort of bore the brunt of the military costs of the wars of the 20th century in Russia. But when you talk about collectivization, it's a little known fact that the Central Asians in particular, like you said, the Kazakhs, the Uzbeks, were absolutely decimated in terms of...
Well, the Kazakhs were, the Uzbeks, not so much. The Uzbeks did pretty well demographically.
Mm-hmm. But yeah, I remember I was reading somewhere, I can't remember, but yeah, you said it was like almost 40% of the population of certain groups was basically... So what you had happen in the Holodomor in Ukraine was basically replicated across these different Central Asian populations.
There was a famine roughly at the same time in Kazakhstan, but it's for different reasons, because the Holodomor in Ukraine was caused by removing all of the grain and then sealing the borders so people can't flee. What happened in Kazakhstan is they forced the pastoralists, as I said, to not move around. So they exhausted very rapidly the limited pasture land. They'd always been semi-nomadic. They have transhumant, so they'd have a winter pasture and a summer pasture. But since they couldn't move to the winter pasture, they had the stark option: either kill the animals and eat them now, or let the animals all die and not get the food. So, but once you've eaten the food from slaughtering the animals, then you're next to starve. So it was
right. Now there's literally nothing to eat.
Right.
God, that's terrible. Oh, we got a super chat from Monophthalmus. Thanks you too for shedding some light on this distant branch of my people. Very cool. Happy to do it. This has been a fun conversation. This is a funny one. Are there any American colonies in Siberia? I would imagine not.
Well, there's American is not a nationalnost, so
right.
I'm not sure how you define it. There was a Black American colony in Uzbekistan in the 1930s.
Really?
Yeah, Langton Hughes in I think it's the second volume of his I Wonder as I Wander kind of autobiography of traveling the world, talks about he was in the Soviet Union traveling with Arthur Koestler, who was the author of Darkness at Noon and the 13th Tribe. So he writes about, he found this group of blacks, I think they're from Alabama, growing cotton in Uzbekistan in, I think it was 32.
Wow, that's not something you'd expect to find. Doesn't Russia have the highest abortion rate per capita in Europe today? It may have the highest abortion rate per capita, but I do know that since basically the 2000s, the abortion rate has gone down very significantly. So although it
there's
is
much
still
greater
high,
access to both imported and domestically produced birth control. Right? So, when I was in Kyrgyzstan, you weren't finding Russian. I mean, they had them, but you could find for the same price anywhere else in the world Durex.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And also, I know now it seems that most of the very high abortion rates tend to be concentrated more so in the eastern part of the country and in Siberia. You tend to have more abortion rates over there, from what I
didn't know
read.
that, but
I was reading some article maybe a month ago. What someone said? Communism in Russia is the best thing for America, something like that. Sorry, not sure what you mean. I'm trying to parse out this question, but basically that communism in Russia is good for the American state, something like that. It seems sort of analogous to something like Burnham said once, that having a strong external enemy is good for
that's kind of like the Rothbard thesis. War is the health of the state.
Yeah. I could see how that would be correct. At what rate were the Germans marrying out? So outgroup marriage.
Very high. So by the time we get to the collapse of the Soviet Union, something like almost half had married Russians or Ukrainians.
They're like those hot Slavic chicks too, just as much as anybody else.
Well, they're just not Germans available. They were dispersed all over the place. I mean, so a lot of times you would have the guy gets deported to Kazakhstan with his family, and then he's mobilized in the labor army and sent to the Urals. And so he arrives there in 1942, and finally in 1948, 6 years later, they send him back to Kazakhstan. Maybe his wife is still alive, but he can't find her. So he marries somebody else.
Mm-hmm.
And there's not a lot of German left. So usually they would opt for the Russians or sometimes Ukrainians, sometimes Polish. Not very often Central Asian. Almost all of the marriages were either Russians and then the next largest group Ukrainian.
Next up, are these Germans more Prussian or Bavarian, Protestant or Catholic?
Well, some came from Prussia, mostly the Mennonites, but most of them were Lutherans. Most of them are coming from Hesse, Baden, Württemberg, the Palatine, so areas on the Rhine in the western part of Germany.
Mm-hmm. Mr. Patriarch, why not start your own colony on the Siberian coast? Emigre colony sounds nice in this day and age. Well, basically, I live in Siberia already, just on the other side of the Bering Sea. That's how I like to think about it. I don't see myself emigrating to.
Can you speak Chukchi? You should learn Chukchi.
I cannot speak Chukchi. Although there is it's interesting you bring that up because Neo-Confucian orthodoxy, because some of the indigenous Alaskans in the northwest of the state are the same ethnic group of other indigenous, you could call them Siberians on the other side of the ocean. They speak the same language. They have, the same same familial links, same culture and whatnot. And after the Soviet Union, there was basically a hard line drawn between Alaskan natives and Siberian natives, who were, again, the same, but just with these sort of arbitrary jurisdictional distinctions that were cut off from each other. And then after the end of the Soviet Union, you had the ability, and which still happens today, of sort of, people sort of go back and forth of these Yupik peoples to meet with their relatives, go visit and whatever. In fact, some of these places are so close that there's 2 islands, one Russian, one Alaskan. There's Little and Big Diomede Island, and they both have indigenous villages on them. And you can literally just look across the ocean and be, I think they're only 3 miles apart. They're extremely close together. So I suppose in the Arctic winter, just walking across the ice and disappearing into Siberia would be possible, but it's not something I plan on doing. Let's see. Yeah, and I remember my dad telling me he used to work out on these as a mechanic on these remote radar sites. And yeah, he's like, yeah, I remember one of our locations. I think he said it was Tin City, Alaska. He just looked out and he could see across the water. He's like, oh, that must be Russia over there.
Who was that Canadian who did work on Siberian, on polar peoples? Because he had a whole book where he went to Siberia as part of this, kind of connecting, the indigenous peoples of the polar region.
Mm-hmm.
Probably Moat.
I'm not sure, but there is definitely a lot of similarity between Siberian natives, Alaska natives, and Canadian natives. Those polar Yupik peoples, they do have a lot of high abortion rates in Siberia. All the better. You can easily outpopulate the locals. It's a very dark Machiavellian thing to say. Do not agree. And I think at this day and age, a good chunk of the locals in Siberia, there are certain states that are Yupik Siberian native, but a lot of them are majority Russians, and it's a lot of Russians getting this abortion. So even by your own metric, I would say that is incorrect. Here we go. Abortion in Russia is weird because it's mostly an older woman thing, and also tied to prostitution. It's going down over time as that generation dies out, or so I've heard from Glow in the Dark. I wouldn't know, but it does seem to be going down quite a bit. Oh, here we go. From 99 Iron Duke. The Russian army, even the Napoleonic and Crimean era, had lots of senior German officers. Is this correct?
Yeah, but we already went over, these are not the German colonists from the Volga and the Black Sea. These are the Baltic German barons from the Teutonic and Livonian Knights that came under Russian rule under Peter the Great when he took Ettland and Livland from Sweden, and then later the Russians take Courland from Poland. So these are not descendants of immigrants into the Russian Empire. These were people who are descendant of the German order state that had been established by the Teutonic Knights and Hanseatic League in what is now Estonia and Latvia.
What do we know about their dialects of German? Any survival historical works, collections of their culture?
There's quite a bit. It's not my area of expertise. I'm basically a political historian. One thing I do know about the Koloniestdeutsch spoken by the Volga Germans as opposed to the Black Sea Germans or Bessarabian Germans is that all of the modern words, because they get there in the 1760s and 70s, are Russian. So instead of Wagen for car, it's Machina. Instead of Kühlschrank for refrigerator, it's Holodnik. So anything technological that comes after the 18th century, it's a Russian loan word.
That's interesting. That's actually sounds similar to Afrikaans, which was basically that calcified Dutch with a bunch of borrowed words. It seems like the German.
So what do they borrow from Zulu?
Sometimes some of them are Xhosa borrowed words. Some of them are Malay borrowed words. So Malaysian. So like the word mooi, which means like nice or pretty, is Malaysian, but everyone just use it's an official Afrikaans word, mooi, MOOI. It's just one example off the top of my head, and they got a lot of their own slang words, and the syntax is closer to English, from what I understand, compared to Dutch. So it's that's interesting. All right, looks like we're done. All right, guys, thank you very much for coming by. Otto, do you have anything you want to shill before we go?
Well, my book. That's the main thing shilling here, even in the title of the stream. So if you go to the University of Columbia website, link down there, you can order it. It's $42, and it's a little less than 300 pages, but it reads easy. It's got a lot of information in it that's never been available in English before. So I used mostly Russian language sources, a number of German language sources, but a lot of archives from Moscow, some interviews with old ethnic Germans in Kyrgyzstan, and a few other sources that not readily available, especially now, since it doesn't look like American scholars are going to have access to archives in Moscow for a few years.
Yeah, to say the least. Also, I have a link to Otto's YouTube channel if you want to go check that out. As far as what I got going on this channel, fortunately, I was able to get some time by myself for this weekend. So I think I'm going to be making a video tonight/tomorrow critiquing the neo-paganist worldview. So that should be coming out here within the next day or two. As far as any other things coming on my channel, I'll let you guys know. But thanks for the support. If you want to support the channel, you guys are please encouraged to go check out Subscribestar or PayPal links. Thank you very much, and I'll talk to you guys next time. Patriarch.
Yeah. Thank you very much.
Yep.